The rain was coming down in sheets, heavy and unrelenting, turning the asphalt of the midnight highway into a slick black mirror. Julian's hands, calloused and stained with engine grease, gripped the massive steering wheel of the Peterbilt 389. The rhythmic, hypnotic thud of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the cab. He was pushing 70 miles an hour on a desolate stretch of road, swallowed by the darkness when the headlights caught it, a sudden, frantic blur of white darting directly into his path. He didn't think, he reacted. Julian slammed his heavy boot onto the brake pedal, the air brakes screaming in protest as 18 wheels locked and skidded. The colossal weight of the loaded trailer violently shrieked against the wet pavement, threatening to jackknife. The rig fishtailed, tearing up gravel and mud on the shoulder, before shuddering to a violent, heart-stopping halt mere inches from a trembling figure. Through the rain-battered glass, illuminated by the harsh glare of the halogen lights, stood a woman. She was soaked to the bone, her chest heaving, eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. And she wasn't alone. From the dense, ink-black tree line behind her, 3 men emerged, sprinting toward the road with a predatory urgency that Julian recognized instantly. He threw open the heavy passenger door. "Get in!" He roared over the thunder and the idling engine. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the metal steps, slipping, bruising her shins, and threw herself into the cavernous cab. Before the door had even slammed shut, Julian was already grinding the gears. The massive engine roared like a waking beast. He dumped the clutch and the semi lunged forward, blowing a thick cloud of black diesel smoke directly into the faces of the pursuers who had just reached the edge of the asphalt. They shrank away in the rearview mirror, cursing, quickly swallowed by the storm in the distance as Julian pushed the rig back up to speed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the howling wind and her ragged, shallow breathing. Julian Vance was not a truck driver. Or rather, he wasn't supposed to be. Beneath the faded flannel shirt and the grease under his fingernails beat the heart of a ruthless predator. He was the heir and sole operator of the Vance syndicate, a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar empire that dealt in high-stakes logistics, shadow acquisitions, and ventures that operated far outside the bounds of the law. He was a man accustomed to bespoke Italian suits, penthouse boardrooms, and having absolute control over life and death. But a week ago, that control had been shattered. His most vicious rival, a cartel boss named Victor Thorne, had orchestrated a massive, coordinated hit. Julian's empire had been infiltrated, his closest associates compromised, and a massive bounty placed on his head. To survive, to regroup and plan his retaliation, the billionaire had to become a ghost. He bought a rigged-up 18-wheeler under a fake name, abandoned his fortune, and vanished onto the endless arteries of the country's highways, hiding in plain sight. He glanced at the passenger seat. The woman was curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her legs, shivering violently. Her clothes were torn, her bare feet scratched and bleeding. Yet, even underneath the terror and the grime, she possessed an arresting, haunting beauty. They were going to kill me, she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the hum of the tires. "They're gone now," Julian replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried a strange, commanding weight. He reached into the sleeper compartment behind him and tossed her a heavy, fleece-lined blanket. "Wrap up, you're freezing." She pulled the blanket over her shoulders, slowly turning her head to look at him. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a sharp, electrifying awareness. In the dim, amber glow of the dashboard lights, she studied his profile. He was strikingly handsome, sharp jawline, intense, calculating eyes that missed nothing, and an aura of quiet, dangerous power that didn't belong in the cab of a freight truck. Her name was Evelyn, though she wouldn't tell him that tonight. She had spent her entire life feeling like a pawn, manipulated and trapped, and tonight she had made a desperate run for her life. Now, sitting next to this mysterious stranger, the sheer terror of the night morphed into an overwhelming rush of relief. She was alive. She looked at his hands, strong and steady on the wheel, and felt an inexplicable sense of absolute safety. "Thank you," she breathed, shifting closer to him. Julian glanced at her, and in that split second, the air between them shifted. The suffocating tension of the chase dissolved into something entirely different, something raw and intoxicating. The isolation of the storm, the confined space of the cab, and the intoxicating high of surviving death created a perfect storm. Evelyn reached out, her trembling fingers gently touching his cheek. Julian froze. He was a man hunted, a man with a target on his back, but as he looked into her eyes, he saw the same desperate loneliness that mirrored his own. She leaned in, her lips finding his. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It was desperate, hungry, and fueled by the raw animal instinct of survival. Julian groaned, a deep sound vibrating in his chest, and pulled the rig over to a secluded, abandoned rest stop, throwing the parking brake. He pulled her across the console and into his lap. The rest of the world, the assassins, the rival syndicates, the rain outside ceased to exist. In the narrow, shadowed confines of the truck's sleeper cabin, they found a frantic, breathless escape in each other. It was an explosive release of fear and tension, two strangers anchoring themselves to the only warm, living thing in a cold, deadly night. When the gray, unforgiving light of dawn finally broke through the rain-streaked windows, Julian was already awake. He lay perfectly still, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of Evelyn's breathing as she slept against his chest. His heart ached with a sudden, unfamiliar heaviness. He wanted to wake her. He wanted to ask her name, to keep her safe, to hold on to this fragile piece of humanity he had stumbled upon. But reality was a cold blade. He was a dead man walking. Victor Thorne's men were scouring the state, and any slip-up would end in a bloodbath. If they found him, they would torture and kill anyone with him. Staying with her, even for an hour longer, was a death sentence for her. With excruciating care, Julian slipped out from under her, covering her gently with the heavy blanket. He dressed in silence. He took a thick envelope of emergency cash from his duffel bag, thousands of dollars in untraceable bills, and placed it gently on the pillow beside her face. It was enough for her to disappear, to start over somewhere safe. He didn't leave a note. He didn't have the words. He simply opened the heavy cab door, stepped out into the freezing morning mist, and walked away without looking back, leaving the truck, the keys, and the only woman who had ever made him feel human far behind. 4 years. That was how long it took for the blood to wash away and the dust to settle. Victor Thorne was dead, his cartel dismantled piece by bloody piece by Julian's loyal, lethal inner circle. Yet Julian remained in the shadows. He had kept the grease-stained hands and the heavy steel boots, trading the boardroom for a massive covert repair shop on the outskirts of the city. He was still a phantom, driving the freight lines, repairing engines, because the whispers in the underworld never truly died. Someone somewhere was still hunting for the ghost of the Vance syndicate. He had a tight crew now: Marcus, a giant of a man with a mind like a steel trap, and a few others who would take a bullet for him without blinking. They operated out of the garage, a fortress disguised as a blue-collar haven. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of motor oil and ozone, when the past walked right through the open bay doors. Julian was wiping grease from a wrench when he heard the hesitant crunch of footsteps on the gravel. He turned, his muscles instinctively tensing for a fight. But it wasn't a hit squad. It was a woman. The sunlight caught her hair, and Julian's heart violently slammed against his ribs, stealing the breath from his lungs. It was her, the woman from the storm. The ghost that had haunted his dreams for 4 long years. She looked older, her eyes heavier with an exhausted kind of grief, but it was undeniably her. And her hand was wrapped tightly around the tiny fingers of a little girl. The child couldn't have been more than 3 years old, with curls tumbling over her forehead and a pair of piercing, calculating eyes that Julian recognized with a sickening, earth-shattering jolt. They were his eyes. Recognized with a sickening, earth-shattering jolt. They were his eyes. "I've been looking everywhere for you," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but laced with a desperate steel. Julian dropped the wrench. It clanged against the concrete. Suddenly, the paranoid puzzle pieces shifted in his mind. The whispers, the feeling of being tracked, it wasn't a rival syndicate looking for him. It was her. "Who sent you?" He demanded, his voice dangerously low, his protective instincts warring with an insane, blooming hope. "No one sent me," she fired back, stepping forward, pulling the little girl slightly behind her leg. "I found you because I had to, because of her." Evelyn took a ragged breath. "Her name is Mia, and she's yours." The silence in the garage was deafening. Julian, a man who built an empire on calculated risks and cold, hard facts, felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. "Impossible," he choked out. "You think you can just walk in here after 4 years and—" "I don't expect you to believe me blindly," Evelyn interrupted, her eyes flashing with hurt and defiance. "Do the test." Do whatever you have to do, but she needs a father, Julian. And you are going to marry me. The audacity of the demand hit him like a physical blow. He didn't know her name until today, he didn't know her world, and now she was demanding a wedding ring? Julian called Marcus. Within hours, a private, trusted medical contact was drawing blood. For 2 agonizing days, Julian avoided the garage, his mind a chaotic storm of denial and yearning. When the encrypted email finally pinged on his phone, the result was a glaring, undeniable 99.9%. Mia was his daughter. The wedding was a sterile, surreal blur. There was no white dress, no music, no celebration. Just the cold fluorescent lights of a dreary city hall. Julian stood in his cleanest work boots and a dark button-down shirt, staring at the woman signing a marriage certificate, binding her life to his. He felt an overwhelming, terrifying surge of protectiveness. He was a father. He had a family. As they stepped out of the judge's office, little Mia tugged urgently at Julian's jeans. He knelt down, his massive frame dwarfing the tiny girl. She held up her wrist, displaying a bright pink, chunky smartwatch. "Mommy says you're my daddy now," she chirped, her voice a sweet melody that cracked his hardened heart wide open. "Can you put your number in my phone? So I can call you if I get scared?" Julian's throat tightened. He carefully typed his private, encrypted cell number into the little device, saving it under Dad. "Anytime," he whispered fiercely, pressing a kiss to her soft curls. "Day or night, Mia, I'll always answer." But the fragile, beautiful illusion shattered the moment they walked out of the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. A sleek, tinted Mercedes SUV was idling violently at the curb. Evelyn's entire demeanor instantly shifted from exhausted relief to pure, frantic terror. She snatched the marriage certificate from Julian's hand, her face completely drained of color. "I have to go," she blurted out, panic bleeding into her voice. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were darting nervously around the street. "I have urgent business. I'll contact you." "Evelyn, wait, what the hell is going on?" Julian reached for her arm, but she ripped it away, shoving a bewildered Mia into the back seat of the waiting car. Before Julian could demand answers, before he could pull his daughter back into his arms, Evelyn slammed the door. The SUV's tires squealed against the pavement, tearing away into the city traffic, leaving Julian standing entirely alone on the sidewalk. The ink on their marriage certificate wasn't even dry, and his wife and child were gone, swallowed by a dangerous secret he hadn't even begun to uncover. The phantom threat he'd been hiding from was nothing compared to the sinking, horrific realization that he had just let his daughter drive off into a war zone he knew absolutely nothing about. The wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate loomed ahead like the jaws of a gilded trap. Evelyn's hands shook uncontrollably as the SUV tires crunched over the pristine white gravel of her parents' driveway. She gripped her daughter's tiny hands so hard that her knuckles turned white. Mia looked up, her large, observant eyes sensing her mother's suffocating fear. This wasn't a home. It was a snake pit. Her parents, Arthur and Eleanor Sterling, ran a mid-sized, cutthroat real estate firm. To them, Evelyn wasn't a daughter. She was a defective asset, a stain on their pristine reputation ever since she had shown up pregnant, refusing to name the father. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the oppressive, sterile scent of expensive perfume and floor wax hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Waiting in the opulent foyer were her parents, flanked by her 2 older sisters, Chloe and Vanessa. They looked like porcelain dolls, dressed in designer silk, their eyes glittering with undisguised malice. "Look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," Chloe sneered, swirling a glass of champagne. "And she brought the little bastard with her." "Watch your mouth," Evelyn snapped, stepping in front of Mia. Arthur Sterling, a man whose face was frozen in a perpetual scowl of disappointment, slammed his cane against the marble floor. "Enough. You will listen to me, Evelyn. The Croft family has officially agreed to the merger. Preston Croft is willing to marry you next week. It will double the size of our company, cement our legacy, and finally wash away the pathetic mess you've made of your life." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Preston Croft was a monster, wealthy, arrogant sadist who had always looked at her like a piece of meat. "I told you, I am not marrying Preston. I just got married today. I found him, Mia's father. We are legally married." The foyer erupted into cruel, mocking laughter. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. What did you do? Find some homeless mechanic on the street to sign a piece of paper?" "Preston is a billionaire, Evelyn. But there is one condition. Arthur stepped closer, his shadow falling over little Mia. The Crofts don't want another man's trash in their bloodline. The child goes to an orphanage. Today. No. Evelyn screamed, the primal instinct of a mother turning her into a lioness. She scooped Mia into her arms, backing toward the door. You are insane. I will never give up my daughter. Grab her. Arthur barked. Before Evelyn could reach the handle, the family's private security guards stepped out from the shadows. Two massive men seized Evelyn by the arms, violently prying her fingers away from her screaming child. Evelyn kicked, thrashed, and bit, sobbing hysterically as Arthur grabbed Mia by the arm. The little girl was shrieking, tears streaming down her face. Put her in the West Wing study and lock the door, Arthur ordered his men, rubbing his temples in annoyance as he watched his daughter struggle. Leave her there until Evelyn signs the annulment and the Croft contract. They dragged the terrified child down the hall and shoved her into the dusty, unused study. The heavy lock clicked with a sickening finality. She has asthma. Evelyn shrieked, her voice tearing her throat, dropping to her knees as the guards held her down. Arthur, please. It's an old room, the dust, the panic. She doesn't have her inhaler. She's going to die. Let her out. She will be fine. Stop being hysterical, Eleanor said coldly, sipping her tea. You brought this on yourself, Evelyn. Inside the pitch-black study, the air was thick with years of undisturbed dust. Mia backed into a corner, her tiny chest heaving. The panic was a living thing, wrapping its claws around her throat. She tried to cry for her mommy, but the sound came out as a ragged, wet wheeze. Her lungs felt like they were shrinking, filling with cement. She was suffocating. Trembling, her vision blurring at the edges, she remembered the giant man with the kind eyes. Daddy. With agonizing slowness, her tiny, numb fingers fumbled with the bright pink smartwatch on her wrist. She found the number. She pressed call. Miles away, Julian was pacing the concrete floor of his garage, his mind a volatile storm of rage and confusion. Suddenly, his encrypted phone vibrated on the metal workbench. The caller ID read, Mia. He snatched it up, his heart leaping into his throat. Mia? Sweetheart, where are you? Instead of a voice, all he heard was a horrific, high-pitched gasp. It was the desperate, drowning sound of a child fighting for air. Then, a tiny, barely audible whisper sliced through the line. Daddy. Can't breathe, help. Julian's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The world around him completely stopped. The careful, restrained trucker vanished, and the ruthless apex predator of the Vance syndicate awoke with a terrifying vengeance. Marcus. Julian roared, his voice shaking the very walls of the garage. Trace this GPS signal. Give me the coordinates right fucking now. Within seconds, Marcus had the location. It was a wealthy suburban estate 20 minutes away. Julian didn't take the truck. He walked to the back of the garage, pulled a tarp off a sleek, pitch-black armored SUV, and loaded a customized Glock into his waistband. His eyes were entirely devoid of humanity. 15 minutes later, the front gates of the Sterling estate didn't just open, they exploded inward as Julian's armored vehicle rammed through them at 60 miles an hour, tearing up the manicured lawn. The family in the foyer froze in absolute horror as the heavy front doors of their mansion were, literally kicked off their hinges, splintering into pieces. Julian stepped into the light, a towering, terrifying force of nature. He didn't say a word. He grabbed the nearest security guard by the throat and hurled him through a plate glass table, the crash echoing like a bomb. Evelyn gasped, tears of disbelief flooding her eyes. Where is she? Julian's voice was a low, demonic growl that vibrated in the floorboards. Down the hall. Evelyn sobbed, pointing frantically. Julian ripped the heavy oak door of the study entirely out of its frame. He found his daughter collapsed on the floor, her lips tinged blue, her eyes rolling back. With terrifying gentleness, he scooped her up, his massive hands completely enveloping her tiny body. He carried her out to Evelyn, who desperately administered the emergency inhaler she had hidden in her pocket. It felt like hours, but slowly, miraculously, the horrific wheezing subsided into ragged, even breaths. Mia clung to Julian's neck, burying her face in his broad shoulder. Julian slowly turned his head to look at Arthur Sterling, his two terrified sisters-in-law, and Evelyn's mother, who were all backed against the wall, paralyzed by fear. If any of you, Julian spoke, his voice carrying the deadly, freezing promise of an executioner, ever look at my wife or breathe in the direction of my daughter again. I will burn your company to ash. I will erase your name from the earth. And I will make you beg for death before I finally give it to you." He wrapped his free arm around Evelyn, pulling her against his side, and walked out of the shattered mansion, leaving the Sterling family trembling in the wreckage. But the nightmare was far from over. Julian's explosive, violent intervention had triggered a blip on an intelligence radar far above the street level. In a penthouse overlooking the city skyline, an older, distinguished man with eyes exactly like Julian's watched a security feed of the smashed gates. Richard Vance, Julian's estranged billionaire father, smiled for the first time in 4 years. He picked up his phone. "My son is alive," the old man said to the receiver. "And it appears I have a granddaughter. Call his sister. Tell her we are hosting the grandest charity gala this city has ever seen. Invite the Sterlings, invite the Crofts. It's time to bring my family home." The gold leaf invitations to the Vance Foundation Charity Gala were the most coveted currency in the city's high society. Everyone who was anyone was there: billionaires, politicians, and ruthless corporate titans. Among them were the Sterlings and the Crofts, practically salivating at the rumor that the elusive, legendary Richard Vance was looking to hand out the most lucrative real estate development contract of the decade. Evelyn stood near a towering ice sculpture, feeling completely numb, her stomach twisting into painful knots. She shouldn't be here. She wanted to be in the safe, quiet warmth of Julian's apartment, watching Mia sleep. But her father, Arthur, had cornered her that morning with a legion of corporate lawyers, threatening to bury Julian's pathetic little mechanic shop in endless, bankrupting lawsuits and drag Mia through a vicious, fabricated custody battle if Evelyn didn't show up to publicly apologize to the Crofts and save the Sterling family face. To protect the man who had saved her and the daughter who was her entire world, she had walked straight back into the snake pit, alone. She had told Julian she was just running a quick errand. It didn't take long for the vultures to circle. Preston Croft slithered through the crowd, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand, his eyes raking over Evelyn's simple, unadorned dress with undisguised disgust. Flanking him were Chloe and Vanessa, their lips painted in cruel, victorious smiles. "Look at you," Preston sneered, leaning in so close Evelyn could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Looking like a stray dog that just got dragged out of the rain, again." "Leave me alone, Preston," Evelyn said, her voice trembling, though she tried to stand tall. "Or what?" Vanessa chimed in, laughing sharply. "Your little trucker husband is going to hit someone with his wrench? You are a joke, Evelyn. A pregnant runaway whore who married a grease monkey. You ruined your life, and tonight, once my father signs this contract with Mr. Vance, we're going to make sure your feral little family is entirely erased from this city." Across town, the quiet of the garage was broken by the sound of a zipper. Julian stood in the dim light of his bedroom, staring at the mirror. Gone was the faded flannel. Gone were the grease-stained jeans. He was clad in a masterfully tailored midnight black Tom Ford suit armor he hadn't worn in 4 long, bloody years. He adjusted the platinum cuffs at his wrists, his jaw set in a line of pure lethal granite. He had found the gold leaf invitation in the mail, addressed not to him but to Miss Maya Vance. His father knew. The phantom was dead. The heir was awake. He looked down at Mia, who was twirling in a beautiful midnight blue velvet dress Marcus had rushed to buy an hour ago. "Ready, little bird?" Julian asked, his voice a low rumble. "To see Grandpa?" She beamed, clutching her pink smartwatch. "Yes." Back at the gala, the psychological torture had reached its peak. Preston grabbed Evelyn's wrist, his grip bruising. "You're going to get on your knees tonight and beg me to take you back, Evelyn. And maybe, just maybe, I won't let your father throw that bastard child of yours into the system." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear of pure, helpless despair sliding down her cheek. Suddenly, a deafening hush fell over the cavernous ballroom. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The heavy, towering oak doors at the entrance were pushed open by private security, and the murmurs of the elite crowd died in their throats. Julian walked into the room. The transformation was absolute and terrifying. He radiated a dark, suffocating power, moving with the predatory grace of a king stepping onto a battlefield. He held his tiny daughter's hand, his eyes scanning the crowd like a sniper looking for a target until they locked onto Evelyn. And the man holding her wrist. Evelyn gasped, the breath leaving her lungs. "Julian!" Croft blinked, momentarily thrown off by the imposing figure before a nasty, arrogant smirk crawled back onto his face. He didn't recognize the billionaire heir. He only saw the mechanic the Sterlings had mocked. Well, well. The grease monkey actually knows how to rent a tuxedo. Are you lost, pal? The service entrance is around back. Julian didn't even look at Preston. He gently pulled Evelyn behind him, shielding her with his massive frame. Mia, entirely unfazed by the glaring, glittering crowd, stepped forward in her velvet dress. "We aren't lost," the little girl announced, her sweet, clear voice echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. "I'm looking for my grandpa. He invited me." For a split second, there was silence. Then Chloe let out a sharp, ugly bark of laughter. Vanessa joined in, and soon Preston and several other wealthy guests were chuckling. It was a cruel, mocking sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Oh, sweetie," Arthur Sterling smeared, stepping up beside Preston, looking down at Mia with utter contempt. "Your grandpa is probably out on the street corner begging for change. You don't belong here. Security, remove this trash from the premises." But the security guards didn't move. They stood frozen, staring past the Sterlings. The murmurs completely vanished as the heavy velvet curtains at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase parted. Richard Vance, the patriarch, the billionaire titan who held the fate of every company in the room in the palm of his hand, began to slowly descend the marble steps. He was an older, sharper, colder version of Julian. The crowd physically parted, stepping back in awe and fear. Arthur Sterling frantically puffed out his chest, plastering on a desperate, fawning smile. He stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Vance." "It is an absolute honor to finally." Richard Vance didn't even blink. He walked right past Arthur Sterling, leaving the man's hand suspended in midair. The billionaire walked straight toward the center of the room, stopping directly in front of the towering man in the black suit, the trembling woman, and the little girl in the velvet dress. The arrogant smiles on the faces of Preston Croft and the Sterlings began to falter, slowly replaced by a creeping icy dread as Richard Vance fell to one knee, right in the middle of the ballroom, and looked directly into Mia's eyes. The cavernous ballroom was so impossibly quiet that the collective breathing of the city's elite sounded like a rushing wind. Richard Vance, a man who had brought prime ministers and global conglomerates to their knees, rested his hands on his expensive tailored trousers, ignoring the cold marble seeping into his joints. He looked at the little girl in the midnight blue velvet dress. A tear, shockingly bright against his weathered, ruthless face, slipped down his cheek. "Hello, Mia," Richard's voice, usually a weapon that could freeze oceans, cracked with a raw, desperate tenderness. "I have waited a very, very long time to meet you. I am your grandfather." Mia blinked her large, observant eyes, entirely unbothered by the gravity of the moment. She offered a gap-toothed smile and held up her wrist. "Daddy put his number in my watch. Do you want to put yours in too, so I can call you?" A watery, genuine laugh escaped the billionaire patriarch. "I would be honored, little bird." Richard slowly stood, his gaze shifting from the little girl to the towering, dangerous man standing beside her. The warmth in the old man's eyes vanished, replaced by a fierce, blazing pride. "Welcome home, Julian," he said, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the room. "The Vance Empire has missed its king." The sound of shattering glass violently broke the spell. Preston Croft's crystal tumbler had slipped from his numb fingers, exploding into 100 glittering shards on the floor. Arthur Sterling's face drained of all color, taking on the waxy, translucent hue of a corpse. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he had been shot. Chloe and Vanessa were trembling so violently their designer dresses shook. The man they had just called a grease monkey, the man they had mocked, threatened, and tried to strip of his child was Julian Vance. He wasn't just wealthy. He was the sole heir to an underworld and legitimate empire that could swallow the Sterlings and the Crofts whole and not even burp. Julian's eyes, dark and dead as a winter night, slowly panned over to the petrified group. "I gave you a warning this morning, Arthur." Julian's voice was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the building. "I told you what would happen if you ever breathed in my wife's direction again. Julian, Mr. Vance." "Please," Arthur stammered, his knees buckling. He practically fell to the floor, crawling forward a few inches. "It was a misunderstanding. We are family. Evelyn is my daughter. Evelyn is a Vance." Julian snarled, taking a single predatory step forward. You threw her to the wolves. You locked my asthmatic daughter in a dust-filled room to force a business deal. You are a parasite. Julian turned slightly toward his father. Richard Vance simply nodded, his eyes cold. "Marcus," Julian called out. From the shadows of the grand entrance, the massive, imposing figure of Julian's right-hand man stepped forward, holding a sleek black tablet. He wasn't wearing mechanic's overalls anymore. He was flanked by a dozen heavily armed private security contractors in pristine suits. "Execute the protocol," Julian commanded. Marcus tapped the screen once. "Done, boss." Julian looked back at the trembling, sobbing Sterlings and the completely paralyzed Preston Croft. "In the last 30 seconds, Julian explained, his voice chillingly calm, "the Vance syndicate has initiated a hostile takeover of Sterling Real Estate and Croft Holdings. All your assets are frozen. Your credit lines are severed. Your investors have just received a mass communication detailing your corrupt practices and blacklisting you from every financial institution on this continent." Preston fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands, a pathetic, whimpering sound escaping his throat. Vanessa and Chloe were weeping hysterically, the illusion of their superiority completely shattered. "You are bankrupt," Julian continued, delivering the final fatal blow. "You have nothing. And if I ever see your faces in this city again, I will stop using my lawyers and start using my hands. Get them out of my sight." The Vance security team moved in with ruthless efficiency, grabbing the thrashing, sobbing Sterlings and Crofts by their designer collars and dragging them toward the service exit, tossing them out into the cold night exactly like the trash they were. The ballroom was paralyzed. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Julian slowly turned his back on the crowd and looked down at Evelyn. She was shaking, her eyes wide with shock, tears streaming down her face. For 4 years, she had felt like a hunted animal, a burden, a broken thing. She looked at Julian, seeing the billionaire, the apex predator, and suddenly felt incredibly small. "Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking, You did all this to protect us?" Julian's hard, terrifying expression melted. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently cupping her face, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. He didn't care about the hundreds of powerful people watching them. He only saw the woman who had saved him in the rain 4 years ago. "I didn't just do it to protect you, Evelyn," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that finally cracked his impenetrable armor. "I spent 4 years tearing apart a cartel to make the world safe for you. I bought a garage to hide in plain sight so I could find you. I didn't marry you today just to give Mia a father." He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers, the chaotic world around them fading into absolute nothingness. "I married you because from the moment you climbed into my truck in that storm, you owned my soul," Julian whispered fiercely against her lips. "You aren't a runaway. You aren't a pawn. You are my wife. You are my queen. And nobody will ever hurt you again." Evelyn let out a shattered sob, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. The exhaustion, the terror, the years of profound loneliness completely washed away, replaced by an overwhelming, incandescent warmth. He held her tight, wrapping his massive arms around her, anchoring her to the earth. Below them, Mia tugged on her grandfather's tuxedo pants. Richard looked down, tears still wet on his cheeks. She reached up, and the billionaire patriarch scooped the little girl into his arms, holding his granddaughter tightly against his chest as she rested her head on his shoulder. They walked out of the gala not as fugitives, but as a family. The heavy oak doors closed behind them, shutting out the whispers of high society. Outside, the night sky was clear, the stars burning bright over the city. Julian opened the door of the armored SUV, helping his wife and daughter inside. As he slid behind the wheel, his hands no longer stained with grease but steady with absolute purpose, he looked in the rearview mirror. Evelyn was smiling, a real, radiant smile with Mia asleep on her lap. The engine roared to life, not a truck running from the past, but a king driving his family into the future. The storm was finally over.